So today I'm gonna to try a sport that is related to the sword I have in my hand. And now let's go to find the coach. Fancy fencing, or the cool fights in Hollywood blockbusters Star Wars. In Asia, there's a similar sport with unique cultural and spiritual values. In this episode of our niche sports series, we're going to try Asia's fencing art, Kendo.
Hi, Kitty Coach.
Hello and welcome to the new episode, and today we're very happy and honored to have Mr. Kishikawa from Hong Kong Kendo Association to join us. So I want to say hi to everyone.
Hi, hello everyone.
And Mr. Kishikawa, what are we going to do today?
So today I will be your coach, introduce you to the world of Kendo.
Well, and we will start from dressing up. As a modern-day martial art, Kendo is based on traditional samurai and swordsmanship, meaning the way of the sword. It combines martial arts practices and values with strenuous physical activity, and is practiced in at least 70 countries. Hong Kong has 12 Kendo clubs, with about 500 people partaking in this sport regularly. To start off, you will need special armor equipment and uniform, including the shinai, men, do, tela, and kote.
So the origin of the Kendo starts from the Japanese sword, katana. This is the cutting part, the blade.
Later, wooden sword called the bokoto replaced the metal katana for people to practice in a safer way.
So the shape is the same as a sword, but will not kill anyone.
In modern-day Kendo, people use the shinai, which is made up of 4 pieces of broken bamboo, so it's much lighter than bokoto and katana. In fact, beginners don't need the whole gear. Only the shoes to practice the basic stance and movements is all you need to get cracking. And now, let's take a quick look at how Kendo works.
Okay, so the first thing we learn is hold the shinai in a proper way. Always imagine you are holding a sword, not just a piece of bamboo. Remember to bring the hand a little bit inside. It's like a cutting a knife, and the right hand is to handle, to have a control.
And then we learn how to execute the cutting motion together with body movement, stepping forward to reach our opponents.
So we bring up, and then on the right foot we go forward and swing down. Yes. Swing down when we decide to cut.
In Kendo matches, there are 3 hitting points.
So men, kote, and do here. So all the hit in Kendo must be perfect ones. There is only okay or not okay. There is no middle.
You will get points only if you did all postures and movements accurately. What impressed me most is the shouting that accompanies the movements, and that's called the kiai.
So everything starts from the kiai. It means the energy. Kiai comes from the Chinese character ki. Yes. So means your internal energy.
We would typically do the kiai twice, one at the beginning before the fight starts, just like
Yeah! So this is so this is the first kiai that makes us more with energy, makes clear how much determination you had to execute that motion.
Is that good?
Very good.
Really?
Very sharp. You have a very sharp energy.
Having learned the basics, it was time for me to put on the mask and briefly experience a Kendo fight.
Okay. Good. Yes.
I feel like I'm in another world now because I can hear my sound like within the mask.
Okay, now you move forward. Out. And out.
That here is a little bit hurt, but actually like the head and here, I think is fine. Did you use your full strength or not?
No.
No, yeah, I think so. Mr. Kishikawa said practicing Kendo can not only help us build body strength, it also works on spiritual and philosophical aspects and helps us become our better self.
So when we practice, the people really put 100% in everything they do. We try to bring ourselves in the limit. When the opponent hits us, in fact, we say thank you for teaching us our weakness, or for when we strike the opponent, we don't feel that happiness, but we feel, oh, I really execute the right movement, or there is something I must improve. So we always keep analyzing our performance during the practice from how we can develop more and more as a human being.
Okay, so after a quick experience of Kendo, how do you think our lessons today, Mr. Kishikawa?
Well, you perform very nice, very strong spirit and good coordination.
But how can I improve better in the future?
Well, Kendo is a long-term activity, so we cannot just focus in few points. It's a general practice for daily and everyday hard efforts.
So if you haven't tried this sport, I hope you will like this sport. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So this is Jonathan, and we'll see you next time.